When we eat fatty fish or fish oil, we get an initial plasma rise for the fish oil fatty acids, EPA and DHA, which can then be incorporated into red blood cell membranes. When that happens, this is known as the omega-3 index, which measures the percentage of EPA and DHA in red blood cell membranes. Now, the omega-3 index is potentially important because it's associated with cardiovascular disease-related outcomes, such that when the omega-3 index is less than 4%, that's associated with a high risk for CVD-related outcomes. And on the other hand, when the omega-3 index is greater than 8%, that's associated with a lower risk for CVD-related outcomes. Now, others have covered the omega-3 index in this space, so I won't go into it in this video. But what I want to highlight is that there are biomarkers of the omega-3 index. So we don't have to measure the omega-3 index. There are other biomarkers that we can use to evaluate its status. And one of those biomarkers are levels of these two phosphatidylcholines, 36,5, which is a phosphatidylcholine that has 36 carbons and 5 double bonds, and another phosphatidylcholine that has 38 carbons and 6 double bonds, or 38,6. And these two phosphatidylcholines are biomarkers of the omega-3 index. And before jumping into that data, first, let's define what phosphatidylcholines actually are, because this may be a new concept for many people. So phosphatidylcholines are structurally similar to di- and triglycerides, as they have a glycerol backbone, and then they have two fatty acids connected at two of the positions of the glycerol backbone. So that would make them structurally similar to a diglyceride, as a diglyceride has also two fatty acids connected to the glycerol backbone. Now, where it differs from a triglyceride, which would have three fatty acids on the glycerol backbone, phosphatidylcholines have a phosphocholine head group. So phosphatidylcholines, again, have two fatty acids and a phosphocholine head group. And that's what we'll see here. So starting off with the phosphatidylcholine that has 36 carbons and 5 double bonds, or PC36,5, we can see first the glycerol backbone, and then in the first fatty acid position, it's fatty acid 16,0. That's a fatty acid, saturated fatty acid, that has 16 carbons and no double bonds. This is palmitate, or palmitic acid. In the second position, it has a fatty acid with 20 carbons and 5 double bonds. And this is the fish oil fatty acid, EPA. So PC36,5 at one of its fatty acid positions has EPA, or contains EPA. And in the third position, as I mentioned, you can see the PC, or phosphatidylcholine head group. All right, what about PC38,6, 38 carbons, 6 double bonds? Here we can see in the first position it has the same saturated fatty acid, palmitate. In the second position it has a fatty acid with 22 carbons and 6 double bonds, and this is DHA. So these two phosphatidylcholine metabolites, PC36,5 and 38,6, contain EPA and DHA respectively. Now, I mentioned that these two phosphatidylcholines are biomarkers of the omega-3 index, and it's not just because they contain EPA and DHA. There's a study that looked at their direct correlation, which is what we can see here. So on the y-axis, we've got the sum in plasma for the levels of those two phosphatidylcholine metabolites, 36,5 and 38,6. And that's plotted against the omega-3 index. Again, this is the percentage of EPA and DHA in red blood cell membranes. So one is a plasma measure, and another is a measure of the concentration or the content of these two fish oil fatty acids in the membranes. In terms of the correlation, we can see that there, and this is a strong correlation, as that correlation coefficient is greater than 0.7. Anything greater than 0.7 is considered a strong correlation. And it's a significant correlation, as that p-value is far below a significance threshold of less than 0.05. All right, so then the next obvious question to ask is, when is the sum of these two phosphatidylcholines associated with an omega-3 index greater than 8%, as the goal would be to reduce risk for cardiovascular disease outcomes for those that may want to measure levels of these two phosphatidylcholine metabolites. So based on extrapolation of the data here, we can see that when the sum of these two phosphatidylcholines is greater than about 60 micromolar, that's correlated with an omega-3 index greater than 8%. So in terms of what's optimal, that would be my target value, having levels of these two phosphatidylcholines greater than 60 micromolar consistently for every test, with the goal of reducing cardiovascular disease outcome-related risk. Now, this isn't just a health and longevity news channel. I'm also focused on health and longevity potentially optimization. So with that in mind, what's my data? So to find out, I've been using at-home metabolomics, which includes levels of these 2-phosphatidylcholine metabolites, but also more than 600 other metabolites. And if you want to use this kit yourself, which I've covered in many videos on the channel, discount link in the video's description. All right, so on to my data. And we're going to see the sum of these 2-phosphatidylcholines from 2023, when I first started tracking, to 2025. And I had 19 tests over that about 3-year period, which is what we'll see here. On the y-axis, we've got the sum of those 2-phosphatidylcholines plotted against time. Now, over the first 5 tests in 2023, average levels of these 2-phosphatidylcholines was 98 micromolar. In 2024, over 9 tests, average was 89 micromolar. And in 2025, after the first 5 tests, 80 micromolar. So if you remember, what's optimal for the sum of these 2-phosphatidylcholines, at least based on their correlation with the omega-3 index, it's greater than 60 micromolar. So for almost all of these tests, and when looking at year-to-year change, we can give that a check mark, as I've consistently been greater than 60 micromolar for almost all tests except for 1. But note that the trend line is going in the wrong direction. And if I'm not trying to get better, at worst I'll stay the same and potentially get worse. So I want to know what may be underlying keeping levels of these 2-phosphatidylcholines relatively high, resisting their age-related change. So again, so that I can potentially reduce CVD-related risk, CVD outcome-related risk. So with that in mind, which factors are correlated with higher levels of these 2-phosphatidylcholines? So first, and the most obvious, would be fish intake. Since 2015, every day I've eaten sardines, at least 1 can of sardines. So that would be the most obvious place to start. And in terms of which brand that I use, it's shown there. It's the Crown Prince sardines, skinless and boneless, in olive oil. I drain the olive oil before eating the sardines though. All right, so on to the data. On the y-axis, we've got the sum of those 2-phosphatidylcholines plotted against my average daily sardine intake. And for those who may wonder how I'm able to calculate correlations, because I've weighed all of my food since 2015 and entered that data into a diet tracking app, Chronometer, and if you want to use Chronometer yourself, there's a discount link in the video's description. I then pull the Chronometer data into a spreadsheet, and then every blood test has a corresponding average dietary intake. So for example, if there are 50 days in between tests, because I'm tracking diet in conjunction with blood and other biomarkers, I can take the average of those 50 days and then it lines up with the latter blood test. And with enough blood tests or other biomarkers, I can look at correlations, which is what we can see here. So there is a positive correlation in my data for sardine intake with higher levels of these 2-phosphatidylcholines, but note the p-value is outside of that significance threshold of less than 0.05. So technically, and surprisingly, sardine intake, and this is where I get the majority of my fish oil fatty acids from, for almost no test, maybe 1 test out of 60 plus tests since 2015, have I supplemented with fish oil. And salmon has made very rare appearances in my diet over the past 10 years. It's almost exclusively from sardines. So with that in mind, and when looking at these data, this would suggest that sardine intake is not significantly correlated with levels of these 2-phosphatidylcholines that are biomarkers of the omega-3 index, which then raises the question, what is significantly correlated with the sum of these 2-phosphatidylcholines? So to address that, I looked at correlations for 53 foods versus the sum of these 2-phosphatidylcholines. And first, we'll start off with foods that were positively correlated. In other words, higher levels of the food are correlated with higher levels of the sum of these 2-phosphatidylcholines. And I have 19 tests. Again, I have 19 tests over that about 3-year period. So that's what we'll see here. And starting off with sardines, just to put it into perspective, I included sardines so that we can see where it ranks compared to other foods. Atop the list, though, we can see that it's not sardines, and it's 3 other foods that meet that statistical significance threshold of less than 0.05, cloves, corn, and bananas. So these data suggest that when my intake of these 3 foods is relatively higher, that's significantly correlated for whatever reason with higher levels of these 2-phosphatidylcholines that are biomarkers of the omega-3 index. And if you remember earlier, I mentioned that when we eat fish, fatty fish, or fish oil, that can lead to an initial rise for EPA and DHA, but that's only one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is EPA and DHA can be degraded and metabolized in other metabolic pathways. So sure, we can increase intake, but if degradation is also high, we won't see a relatively high omega-3 index. and that there are other foods that are more strongly correlated relative to sardines, again, the major source of my fish oil fatty acids, it suggests that maybe cloves, corn, and banana may be involved in mechanisms that help keep levels of these 2-phosphatidylcholines high. But this is only half of the story. What about foods that are negatively correlated with the sum of these 2-phosphatidylcholines? A given biomarker may be impacted not just by foods or nutrients that can increase it, but also foods or nutrients that may decrease it. So I also included the top portion of that list here using 0.13, which is the significance threshold for sardines. And if you want to see the full correlation list, that's in the correlations tier on Patreon. Atop the list, we can see that there are 2 foods that meet a statistical significance threshold less than 0.05, tomato and eggs. And these data suggest that when tomato and eggs are on the higher side of my intake range, that's significantly correlated with lower levels of these 2-phosphatidylcholines. Again, for whatever reason, I don't know what mechanism that they would be involved in. All right, so what do I then do with this information? I've got foods that are associated with higher levels of these 2-phosphatidylcholines and foods that are correlated with lower levels. So for the most recent test, which I took in mid-September, I aimed for higher levels of cloves and corn. And if correlation equals causation, and if these foods are involved in mechanisms that help keep levels of these phosphatidylcholines high, keeping them towards the higher end of my range should help keep these metabolites relatively high. On the other hand, I didn't follow the correlation with the banana, as I tried to reduce my fructose intake to try to push RDW down based on a correlation for total fructose with RDW. Also note that sardines were on the lower side of my range. Again, I haven't taken them out, but on the lower side of my range. So we'll have to see if following 2 correlations and not following 2 correlations that are positively correlated with these metabolites can make a dent or make a positive impact on levels of these fish oil fatty acid containing phosphatidylcholines. On the other hand, for the foods that were negatively correlated with the sum of these 2-phosphatidylcholines, I also didn't follow the tomato correlation, as tomatoes are significantly correlated with a lot more biomarkers going in the right direction than wrong, aside from their correlation, its correlation with phosphatidylcholines. But I did follow the correlation with eggs, as I kept that on the lower side of my range. So collectively, I followed 3 correlations, and I didn't follow 3 correlations. In terms of how the data will look for test number 20, we'll have to wait about a month because that's how long it takes for the metabolomic data to arrive. If you've ever wondered what's optimal for biomarkers, well, I have a new Patreon tier dedicated specifically to that. It currently includes the 35 biomarkers here, with more than 2 hours of video content, 52 published references. And these aren't the reference ranges. This is what may be optimal for each of these biomarkers based on how they change during aging and or their associations with all-cause mortality risk in the largest published studies that I can find. So if you're interested in that, check it out. And if you're interested in more about my attempts to biohack aging, check us out on Patreon, where I post at least twice per day in 5 Patreon tiers. We've also got discount and affiliate links that you can use to test yourself that help support the channel, including ultralabtest.com, which is where I get the majority of my blood tests done, the clearly filtered water filter, which I use every day, at-home metabolomics, which I mentioned in the video, oral microbiome composition, NAD testing with Genfinity, epigenetic testing with True Diagnostic, at-home blood testing with Cyfox Health, which includes the best epigenetic clock of epigenetic clocks, GrimAge, green tea, which I drink every day, diet tracking with Chronometer, or if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that with the website Buy Me a Coffee. We've also got merch, including Data is my North Star, Figuring Stuff Out is my drug, which I've got on here, and the ConquerAging or Dietary logo as shown there. So if you're interested in any of that, link in the video's description. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.